Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is a yearly garden overview video. Steph and I do a monthly video where we talk about what we're doing in our January, February, March, so on and so forth garden during the year here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. But what I wanted to do this year was a full year overview video of how we think through the garden. Obviously, everything that could be done in a garden can't be done in a single video like this, but I wanted to kind of go through what we're thinking about during the year, why we're thinking about doing things at the time that we're thinking about doing them. And this will allow you to maybe plan ahead a bit, rather than being hit with, we do this in March, you'll know that, the order of things that we actually do during the growing season. We're filming this video in January, so let's jump right into January. We've already visited a couple of gardens in the new year. The Ralston Arboretum is right down the road from us, and did a video with Mark Wethington about winter interest plants. And so, we're going to gardens, looking around and seeing what's interesting this time of year, because you can have interesting plants in your garden even in the winter time. And so it's one of those things we're concentrating on, and I say in almost every one of the monthly videos, go to public gardens different times of the year so that you can see things at different times and also in different conditions. Maybe you have a dry shade garden where you have giant trees and you're trying to figure out what to go under them. Well, a public garden probably has that kind of space. Maybe you have a full sun, just wide open space that you're struggling with because it's a new construction house. They'll probably have spaces like that where you can see plants that are being grown in tough conditions that are similar to what you have. So that's all I'll say that in this video, but I think it's one of the more important things about learning to garden. January, I'm not starting any seed. It'll be February before I start some cool season vegetables, but I am thinking about having all of my materials in place. And so we do 2 rounds of cool season vegetables in our vegetable garden over here. We do our summer vegetables. We do lots of flowering annuals. We do some of our perennials from seed as well. Some interesting things that maybe we can't find any other way. And so I'm trying to make sure that we have all those seeds accounted for, all the ones that we've documented in the past that we really want to regrow. And then we experiment every year and maybe add 10% of the things we're growing in the vegetable garden are new to us. They may end up on the permanent list or they may not. We don't know, but we are experimenting every year. So if you've got old trays, you can get those cleaned up, get them ready, get your seed starting mix, get your seeds in place, and just be ready for that. We do most of our seed starting in the house, and so I have a video on the channel about the seed starting rack that I have inside. It can be done outside and in other ways, and there's lots of videos on YouTube for that, but I think I get the most consistency out of doing them in individual cells. This is, again, my flowering annuals, flowering perennials, all my edible plants, a lot of our even edible perennials we can do from seed as well, like oregano. It would be an example of that. I think I get the most consistency this way, but there are other ways of doing it. During the growing season, it's kind of hard to slow down and clean tools, put things away properly, change oil, sharpen blades, do some of the just basic maintenance things. And so during January and February, it's a great time to pull everything out of a shed, get things cleaned up, get blades sharpened. If you don't know how to do it yourself, again, this is one of those things there's videos on YouTube for. You can learn anything on YouTube, I think, these days. If not, there's probably somebody near you that can sharpen these kinds of things. I have a pickmatic that desperately needs to be ground here so I can cut roots easier with it. I've had this one for a long time and it's worn down about 2 inches on this one side, and I keep resharpening it about once a year, and again allows me to cut through roots as we're digging and planting. We'll change the oil in the lawnmower before we fire it up. We don't have a lot of turf here, but I want to make sure that the lawnmower that I bought is going to last a long time. Sharpen the blade. Any maintenance that needs to be done on those things, January, February is the month to do it. We have lots of different types of covers here. I have this shade cloth. We have row crop covers. We have painter's cloth for things that it tends to be a little heavier, so I don't put it on anything that it can, bend over and hurt. We have towels and sheets and all kinds of things that we will use to cover plants, and we have those readily available in the winter time. The only things I cover are things that are marginal here, which are cold, really cold sensitive to even the temperatures I get here. I've covered one time because it got cold really quick and had not been cold up to that point. Just a few things that I needed to protect. A few of them right here behind me, and then the main time I'm worried about protecting plants is actually toward the end of winter into early spring, when things can wake up a week or two early and then get slammed with a night in the 20s or low 20s Fahrenheit. Those are the times I want to have these covers available. But we are always thinking about collecting. No towel gets thrown away, no sheet gets thrown away. Everything just becomes part of the collection of things that we have available to cover plants in abnormal weather conditions. Another thing about this period of time, this January, February, March window, the soil tends to be wetter. We really don't have to do any watering out here in my area in Raleigh. You may be in a different area of the country that it's not as wet, but the only thing I'd even think about watering this time of year would be containers, potentially, but even they rarely need to be watered here in our winters in Raleigh, in central North Carolina. The ground is really workable this time of year. And so if you have hardscape projects, meaning you want to put a patio in and you need to dig out a space, you need to remove some turf, which would be maybe quite hard to do, especially when it's hot during the summertime. It could be physically draining and much harder to get grass up at that time of year. Right now, our zoysia grass is dormant. If I wanted to reduce the size of it, it would be quite a bit easier to do using either my pick mattock that I showed you just a minute ago that needs to be sharpened, or any kind of shovel. I can cut into this turf and just slide it under and basically roll it back as sod, or get a sod cutter. You can rent a sod cutter to remove some of this turf as well. I'll do any edging that needs to be done right now. So we're early January. Actually, I'll probably wait a little closer to February, to the time I'm going to be mulching, to do this, because I don't like to disturb the soil a lot. Any soil disturbance that we do, outside of planting one plant, I'm not talking about planting one plant, but if I'm doing major soil disturbance, meaning I'm eliminating a bunch of turf, I'm edging all the way around the beds, doing significant work, putting in irrigation, I want to follow that with mulch pretty quickly, because mulch will help put a cap on any of the weed seeds we're bringing up to the top. But again, just one-handed right here, I can go through and edge this out. So if it's a new bed, I'd lay down some sort of, you can either use the upside down spray paint and paint the line that you want on the ground before you edge it, or you could put down a water hose. Sometimes in the winter, water hoses aren't as flexible as we'd like, so the paint is probably a better idea when it's cold outside. But I'll go through and do any new bed prep that I'm going to do. So if that could be edging old beds, or it could be expanding a bed. I put up a video last year about expanding the annual beds in the back garden, and all we did was we went and cut a new edge, painted a new line. It was a similar shape to the one we already had. We just wanted it to be further out. So we trench edged it, took the grass out, put down some compost, and we were ready to go when it was time to plant those summer annuals, which was around the 15th of April for us, and having done the prep at a time of year where it was much easier to dig and it was much cooler outside, so it was physically less demanding and less demanding because the soil's moist and easy to work. Of course, weeding is an all-year event if you're gardening. Doesn't matter if you're vegetable gardening or ornamental gardening. You're gonna have weeds, and we'll talk more about during this video how I go about having less weeds than I might have otherwise. But you're still gonna have some. This is some henbit coming up here in January. It's just hugging the ground right now, waiting for some warmer weather for it to explode and flower. You'll see chickweed as well this time of year. It's just sitting there. It's waiting for some warmer days, and it will absolutely explode, and it will seed itself later. So we'll come through on something like these small weeds and use, and just come through here and just cut them off right at the base, just like that. And hopefully that'll do that one in. I'm always doing that with one hand. We'll also scout everywhere for some of the invasive perennial weeds, the shrubby weeds, things like English ivy, which we have on a tree back here that drops seed down in the garden. It can easily be seen in the winter garden though. You know, it's only up about this tall, it's easy to pull. We have some ligustrum, some other invasives. And again, during the growing season, some of the shrubs and annuals and things can be too big and they can actually hide. Some of those weeds can lie in hiding. This time of year I can go through and see them pretty easily, and most of those will just be hand pulled. They're just one of a kind. We've done a pretty good job of getting the weeds under control, but something like the henbit or chickweed where it grows in a big area, you will use this stirrup hoe or shuffle hoe. This thing goes by a lot of different names, but it is a good tool where you can stand up and do some weeding without it being so back-breaking. One other thing we're thinking about, we leave our leaves in place, and I'll talk about that when we come around to fall gardening. But you know, coming over here into January, February, and March, they're still blowing around a little. There's still a few falling, so we'll go through and make sure that they're not on the lawn. You know, that's not the place to leave the leaves. And we'll go through some of our annuals like pansies. We don't want them laying on top of those, and clean those up. This is a perfectly good time of year to be planting. Again, we're still talking about January, February, March. I'm not going to be planting any tropicals. I'm not going to be planting any summer annuals, you know, for sure. But anything that's been outside and acclimated, you know, this maple would be a great example. It's been in this container at the house for 6 months, and so it's gone through the normal process of going to sleep. It's basically, I would call it locally grown. So it's, you know, it's everything that's happened in my garden has happened to that plant. So I would put that in the ground. The other thing that will become available this time of year for planting will be bare root roses, bare root fruit trees, just fruit trees in general. Again, as long as they're not in bloom or leafing out or looking like they came out of a greenhouse or raced way ahead of other things in your area, I would definitely buy them and put them in the ground, as long as the ground's workable. Obviously, some of you watching this video, the ground is frozen, and so you're gonna be a month behind anything I'm saying. But here in the Raleigh area, we might get a little frozen crust for a day or two during the winter here or there, but for the most part, we can continue to dig holes. So if it's acclimated, plant it. It's better off in the ground. We have several winter annuals planted out here that we kind of put in place to just sit here through the winter and root out, and then in the early spring they really take off. That'd be things like pansies, snapdragons, dianthus. They got stung by some really cold air, slightly colder than they would have liked, and then some rabbits have eaten on them a little bit, but they've been here, they've been rooting in. They should take off in the next few weeks. This is one thing I will fertilize in the winter. If I have any annual, if I have anything left in the cool season garden like kale or something like that, I'll fertilize those, and I'll fertilize these cool season flowering things, and that's it. That's the only type of fertilizing I would do this time of year. This is a great time of year to be transplanting plants, and so, you know, this January, February, March time frame, and here's an ivy I was talking about. I can't, you know, as I'm walking around anytime, you know, I'm pulling these things, and, you know, typically I'll just throw them to the side. You know, it'll be dead right there. If I wanted to transplant this Abelia, which has been in the ground for less than 3 years, okay? Since it's been in the ground less than 3 years, it's probably gonna be pretty easy to dig it out and move it without doing really any prep to it. What I'll typically do is I'll go dig the other hole approximately how big I think I need to dig it. I'll probably end up over digging, because typically I end up with slightly less coming out than you'd like, just from experience of moving lots of plants. Then I'll come over here and I'll dig around this. I'll pull back on my shovel lightly as I go around it. I've shown transplanting plants many times on the channel, and I'll have a plastic tarp right here. And I'll drag this plant onto the plastic tarp. I won't try to pick it up into a wheelbarrow and knock more soil off of it. I like to get them where I can kind of drag them onto a tarp. Then I'll drag the tarp over to the new place where it's gonna go. Then approximate, you know, filling some of that soil back into the hole that I had kind of pre-dug over there. I'm trying not to have it out of the ground for very long. So that's why I'm kind of pre-digging, you know, where the thing is gonna go. Fill back in some, slide it in the hole, make sure it's mounded up a little bit, tamp the soil back in. This time of year, the soil can be really wet, so be careful not to go stomping soil down when you're planting plants, okay? Because it's easy to over-compact soil when it's slightly moist, and it'll end up, you know, being overly compact later on. If the plant's been in the ground for 10 years, you know, really a much older plant, what I like to do is go and root prune it. So I will go around the outside of the drip line where I'm planning on digging it out, and I'll actually physically cut the roots, but I'll leave the plant in place. So I don't do any of that pulling back. I just take my shovel and stick it directly down in the ground, all the way around in a circle around it, and kind of prep it to move, and then I'll wait about a month, and then I'll transplant it. But I find that technique of pre-cutting the roots but not disturbing the entire plant is pretty effective in moving older plants in your garden. But this is a great time of year while they're dormant. You know, even though this thing's evergreen, it's actually dormant. It's asleep. It's been through plenty of cold. It won't even know we moved it. Hopefully, you know, hopefully it'll just start putting on some new root growth before the soil temperature should warm up enough to start putting on some new root growth. That new root growth will support any new growth you're going to get in the top. I will, you know, if I pull this thing out, it has a very, very small root system. I will probably do some top pruning on it to just put it back in, you know, just to balance that back out. If you lose a lot of the root system in this process and don't reduce the top of the plant, it will be difficult for those roots to support everything that's left. So I'll just take some pruners and reduce the plant by maybe a third. If I had any giant holes in my pansy border and dianthus, snapdragons, they're generally some larger ones at the garden centers here in my area in January and February that I can fill in with. Those cool season, for us, cool season annuals up north, you know, pansies last through the summer, but here they don't. They burn out during the summertime. But if I had any holes in here, they are available to fill in. While you're at that garden center or box store or whatever, you'll probably see that they already have elephant ears and caladiums and dahlia tubers and a lot of the summer flowering bulbs, tubers, corms, all those kinds of things. It's way too early to put those things in the ground here. My frost-free date is April 15th. This is something you can look up online very easily. For your address, you know, you can put in your zip code and what is my horticultural zone, which for me that's 7B, and at the same time, what is my frost-free date, or my typical average last frost. My average last frost is around April 15th. That means that at least half the frost occur after April 15th. I wanted you to keep that in mind. So if I'm planting something around April 15th that's marginal or is not winter hardy, an annual of some kind, I'm looking at the 10-day forecast way out past April 15th because we frequently get frost after April 15th. Of course, right around the 1st of February to mid-February, you'll see videos on the channel for us starting our cool season vegetable seeds. This will be about a month before we start our summer seeds, and I'll talk about in a minute. But that things like, for us, it's gonna be lettuce, broccoli, kohlrabi, kale, cauliflower, those things we can start from seed in the house right around the 1st of February. We can put them in the ground the 1st of March. We'll have a cover ready to cover them if it's going to be extremely cold, but those things can take some cold, and we can get some early crops on those things. I'll talk more about how we interplay our summer vegetables into that later. So go ahead and buy those summer bulbs, tubers, even potatoes. They'll have potato starts if you're interested in growing potatoes, which we do here at the house. So all those things are going to be available. Buy them, just leave them in a dark place in the house until later, closer to your frost-free date. The other thing you might want to look up, so there's 3 things to look up. One is your horticultural zone, if you don't know it. Ours is in 7B in Raleigh, and that means my average low winter temperature is between 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what that means. The second thing I said to look up was your frost-free date, and for us it's the middle of April, and we're looking out toward the beginning of May to potentially have a frost. And the third thing that you really want to know if you're growing any edible plants is to find a vegetable planting guide for your area. So I can easily look up Raleigh, North Carolina vegetable planting guide, and it's basically a guide that will tell me if I'm starting them from seed, when I start them from seed in my area, if I'm transplanting them from ones that I've done from seed, what day those go in the ground, if I'm doing them directly from seed in the ground and not pre-starting them inside, what window that they go in the ground in my area. And you'll find those cool season things here in the South, like the lettuce, kohlrabi, beets and carrots and so on and so forth. You'll see that they're on both sides of the chart. So we can do these in March and April, and we can also do them again in October and November. The other thing we're thinking about here in the wintertime is the birds, and so cleaning out bird nest from last year. If you have bird boxes, making sure your suet feeder's full. Birds are an important part of gardening. They do great work on insect problems in the garden, and of course they're just fun. They're fun to listen to. I'm sure you can hear them in the background of this video. And we've seen bluebirds. We're right here at the beginning of January filming this, and we've already seen bluebirds scouting for the spring. So a lot of the things I've talked about so far in this video are mostly planning, getting ready, that kind of thing. Moving forward, sometime in late February, we're going to mulch this garden. We're going to use a triple shredded hardwood. It's going to go right over the leaves that we've left in place from the fall and seal those right in. Between now and then, I want to do all of my what I would call disturbances. So that means I want to have everything weeded. I don't want any of that chickweed or henbit, popping up through my mulch and dropping seeds on top of it. Again, that ivy and all of these other weeds, that are out here, which isn't many because we've been controlling them pretty well. I talked about edging. I talked about digging for drain. If you were going to do drainage work, if you needed to put, take your downspouts and get those out away from your house, do that before you mulch. That way, when you mulch your beds, you'll hopefully be putting a seal on, because every time you dig, you're bringing up weed seeds. And so any pruning that I'm going to do, any winter pruning that I'm going to do, I'm going to have that done also before I mulch as well. This Loropetalum behind me needs what I would call rejuvenation pruning. It's 15 feet tall, and I'd prefer it to be 8 feet tall. And in order to keep it 8 feet tall, I need to bring it down to 5 feet tall, because it's going to grow 3 feet as soon as it leaves out in the spring. But the thing about this plant is it actually blooms on last year's wood. And so I actually do want to see it flower. This is a Carolina Midnight. It's a red flowering cultivar, and I like those flowers, so I'm going to wait until after it flowers. Any of my super early season flowering things, that's going to be azaleas, forsythia, some of our hydrangeas you can't prune in the wintertime, so you really need to know what you have as to when you would prune it. The pruning that I'm going to do before I mulch are going to be some of my perennials, any ornamental grasses that I have. If I was going to cut back my carex, any crazy limbs that, something's got a crazy limb over here, I'm going to take it off. Doesn't matter what time of year it is. But your flowering shrubs, you really need to know what you have. If you don't know that you can winter prune it, just prune it after flowering and you'll be absolutely fine. Dr. Armitage talks about that frequently. Prune after flowering and you can never go wrong. But there are some things, and some things that you don't rely on flowering. So if you have conifers, if you have junipers that you're using on a bank and they're creeping out everywhere further than you want, off with their heads in the late winter. So perfect time of year to do that. If you have boxwoods, any of those leafy evergreen things, this is the time to get after them. And if you need to do a rejuvenation pruning, which is really pruning hard, that's the best time of year to do it. So this Brigadoon St. John's wort is an example of one that just gets cut back toward the end of winter. And again, it's something I want to do before I mulch, because I don't want to be in here disturbing this. So we can actually take a lawnmower over this St. John's wort. Our grasses will just, we'll cut back to where it makes sense. You'll kind of feel, at where you're pruning grasses, I'll typically prune them down to, ornamental grasses, our large growing ornamental grasses. I'll cut them down to maybe 8 inches, something like that. All of my other perennials, again, I'll start to cut them down at that time, and then we'll mulch, and we'll use triple shredded hardwood mulch is what we use here. And I will say that I don't put it down as thick as other people do, because I want to do it twice a year. I'm trying to stop sometime around mid-March. The soil temperature here reaches 65 degrees. When the soil temperature hits 65 degrees, that's when all those summer weed seeds start germinating. We've seen the cool season weeds have already germinated because they did it in the opposite direction as the soil temperature cooled in the fall. Now we're going to get this new round in the spring, and I want that cap on top to prevent a lot of those. And so I won't put down 4 inches of mulch. I'll put down 2.5 inches of mulch. I already have the leaves down here too that fell, and so that's part of the thickness of my mulch. And then I'll come back in the fall and do it again. Just a few more things for this January, February, March window. Again, there's a good amount of work that we do in February, starting our cool season vegetables to be ready to put those in March, getting the place kind of cleaned up, pruned back, and edged and mulched. But that prep work that we're doing during that window, and this would happen later if you were in further northern areas, that prep work will prevent a lot of things that we have, a lot of work that we would have after that, with weeds coming up and that kind of thing. And plus, again, we're doing it at a time of year when it's potentially 65 degrees outside instead of 95 degrees outside. So we've started our cool season vegetables there at the beginning of February. Sometime around the beginning of March, we'll start to think about our summer vegetables and our summer flowers. And all your seed packets, and we have a ton of seed packets. This is just a handful that ran inside and grabbed real quick. On the back of a seed packet, whether it's a flowering summer annual, or whether it's a tomato or bell pepper or something for your vegetable garden, or a perennial if you were starting sorrel or oregano or black-eyed Susans. It just doesn't matter what it is. If you'll look on the back of the packet, if you're starting them from seed, it will tell you how long it is before you can transplant them outside. So if it says 6 to 8 weeks to transplantable size on the back of the packet, look up that frost-free date that I talked about. So my average last frost is April 15th. It's not really a frost-free date, it's the average last frost. I back up 6 to 8 weeks from April 15th, and that's when I start that seed, if that makes any sense. I hope that makes sense. So look on the back of the packet, see how long it takes from seed to transplant, and subtract that from your average last frost date. That's how I know to start the seed. I don't start them any earlier than that because they'll end up stretched out and leggy, and sometimes don't recover well from that during the summertime. I'd prefer them to be just right when they go in the ground. So right around the 1st of March, we'll start, and we'll lay out our seed packets. So the only thing that'll be started the 1st of March will be something that takes as long as 8 weeks before it goes in the ground. Peppers are in that category. And then by mid-March, we'll start the things that are 4 to 6 weeks. 1st of April for things that only take a couple weeks. So things like basil that can germinate really, really quickly and come up, and literally 2 to 3 weeks later go in the ground. So I won't start those until that, and till 3 weeks again before they would go in the ground. The other thing you'll see me do here during this January, February, March window is fertilize all of my shrubs. So I'll go around this entire landscape. I don't even fertilize the plant shrubs individually, really. I just kind of broadcast the fertilizer out. We use organic fertilizers because organic fertilizers feed the soil, and the soil's feeding our plants. Rather than thinking about taking care of our plants from the top down, we're thinking about taking care of the plants from the soil up. And so this is improving our soil. The mulch that I'm doing and the fertilizer that I'm doing is improving that soil. One other thing that's pretty easy to do in this window is toward the end of winter, you can pop your hosta and other hardy perennials out of the ground and cut them with a shovel and divide them and share them. In order to do that, before they start coming back up, you will have needed to mark where they are in the ground, as they went to sleep in the fall. But it is a great time to do it toward the end of winter, beginning of spring. So coming up on spring now, you're gonna go shopping on the first warm day in April, because everybody does. I had a garden center and a nursery for years, and even in March, we get that first really warm weekend and everybody wants to come and buy stuff, and they want to buy stuff that they shouldn't put outside yet, that early as well, and some people will sell it to you for sure. So be careful, again, knowing that, being aware of your frost-free date. If you buy a fern, a tropical fern in mid-March, and you go hang it on your porch and you don't protect it during a frost, it's probably going to get damaged. But this is going to be your best selection of shrubs. So that mid-March window here in my area through the beginning of May, all the garden centers have done all their shopping through the winter and in the fall and in the winter, and they're going to have the best selection. So it's a great time to go and see all the things that they have and things that you want to add to your garden. But be careful, not just about buying annuals too early and putting them out, but also a shrub that potentially came out of a greenhouse, maybe on the West Coast, got shipped across the country, and it's just full of flowers, full of new growth. that's a plant that I will buy, but I won't put it in the ground until after my frost-free date so that I can leave it mobile and put it in the garage. The last thing I want to do is get a plant in full growth, stick it in the ground, and have it immediately zapped with a frost and have that be the start for that plant. And now it's got to go through a whole recovery. And it was a perfect plant 2 weeks ago. A couple weeks before our average last frost date, I will jumpstart some of those summer things that I told you to purchase earlier, like elephant ears, caladiums, dahlias. They can all be started in containers a few weeks before your frost date, and it leaves them mobile so you can bring them inside if you need to, if it's going to be cold. But we only get maybe one frost during that period of time that I have to protect those containers, but I can get those plants growing. And there are a couple videos the last couple years on the channel for jump starting those summer bulbs. Okay, now that we've arrived at our frost-free date or average last frost date, all those things that I've started from seed, the flowers like zinnias can go in the ground, my summer vegetables can go in the ground. I've already put my cool season vegetables in the ground back in March, and by interplanting my summer vegetables in my cool season vegetables, I'm hoping to create some shade on those cool season things that don't like the summer heat and have them go a little longer. So my lettuce will be growing in between my tomatoes at that point. But again, when I'm planting these things in the ground in mid-April, I'm looking out further. Some people won't plant until the 1st of May in my area, and I'll frequently say the farmers haven't even cranked their tractors, and people are trying to put tomatoes in the ground. They don't even know if the battery's dead in their tractor. They're typically dissing their fields after our average last frost date, not before. So keep that in mind. Racing ahead can cost you many times. So we won't do everything from seed. We will go shopping and find some interesting annuals and perennials, year to year that are different or unusual, or something that can't be done from seed. A lot of newer varieties can't be done from seed, or it might be something that can be done from seed, and we'll try it the first year buying it as a plant and planting it in the ground. And then maybe the next year we'll try to acquire seed on it to do it with less expense. Now, of course, the other thing we're doing at that time is we're planting our containers from things that we've started in the house. Again, trying to save money on those kinds of things. Any container that we have out here that we're replanting will typically only take a small amount of soil out of that pot and add some fresh soil in. I don't typically repot the entire container with new soil. And hanging baskets. I like to do my own hanging baskets, and I'll say that if you do your own hanging baskets, you can get a whole summer out of them. If you are buying your hanging baskets, typically the inexpensive hanging baskets that you buy will come in a 10-inch container. You can actually buy empty 12-inch hanging basket containers. And after about a month or two, when you're having to water and water and water on that smaller basket, you can transplant that entire piece over to the larger container. Okay, and use that the rest of the season, and it will it'll give a little bit more root growth area for those, and allow you to keep those, get extended period of time out of your hanging baskets. At the end of the season, you dump them out, you keep those 12-inch baskets for next year and do the exact same thing. Spring is a great time for planting. Fall is also a great time for planting, and in here in North Carolina, we've had in order to let people know that fall is a great time to plant, there's been a lot of fall is for planting, a lot of advertising around that over the years to try to get people to understand that fall is a good time to plant here in my area. It's not better than early spring. Early spring is a great time to be planting, and again, your best selection of the entire year is going to be available at that time. When you're thinking about your garden and you're planning for your garden, think about as much diversity as you possibly can. I think a lot of times we go into these things thinking that one plant can solve our problems. If we could just find that one plant, we could screen our neighbor and make our neighbor go away. If we just found one plant, we could plant our entire foundation, and everything would be easy and life would be great. The more diversity you have in your garden, the more species, the more variety, the more birds, the more animals, the more everything you have in your garden, the more the solution to your problems will live with, your solutions and your problems start living together. okay? So an insect problem comes along and you've got the thing that eats that thing. It might be a bird, it might be a beetle, it might be who, I don't know what it is. But having the solution available is the only way to have that happen is to have lots of things. If you plant a monoculture, if you go and do a garden with 4 different varieties and you go all in with 20 of 4 different things, when an insect or disease problem comes along, it's going to wipe out that entire group. It's much easier and much easier to live with if you're only taking out 1 plant because of an issue and not taking out 20 at the time. We plant potatoes in grow bags a few weeks before our last frost date, and we have a video on the channel for that if you want to learn how to grow potatoes above the ground. It's a pretty easy technique. But toward the frost date, there's lots and lots of perennial edible things that you can plant in the garden. So a lot of times we're talking about gardening, we're talking about tomatoes and peppers and squash and zucchini, all these one season things. There's lots of things like rosemary and sorrel and strawberries and asparagus that you can add during that spring season. They tend to be readily available, and it's a great time of year to be getting those things in the ground. It's nice to have perennial edibles in the ground. It's also nice to plant things like, we can plant sage as a perennial here, and it's nice to have it out here in the garden. When you want rosemary and sage, you just walk out the door and grab it. Those cool season vegetables, you know, that we planted back around the 1st of March in the garden, they're growing and you want to keep harvesting. And this is true with any type of vegetable gardening or edible gardening that you're doing. You want to keep picking because if you stop picking, the plant's going to think it's set seed and it's going to slow down. And so we want to just keep picking those things as long as we can to get as much out of them as we can. One thing I failed to point out over there in the vegetable garden is we do put down a layer of compost in between each planting. So we're doing a cool season crop in the early spring, or doing a warm season crop for the summer, or summer crop, and then we're doing another fall crop. At least once a year, we're recovering that space in a little bit of compost, and we're weeding. And weeding, I don't care what time of year it is. If I was doing a video for anything, it's going to be weeding, because the more you weed, the less you prevent those things from flowering and setting seed and then becoming bigger nuisances in your garden. One thing to be thinking about as you're planting summer climbing things or summer things that get really tall is you may have to stake them. And so out here in the vegetable garden, we use these cattle panels to grow our tomatoes on and our vining vegetables. We'll use various ways to stake up our dahlias, which get quite tall over the course of the summer and end up flopping over. So we're getting ourselves prepared to stake up things later during the summertime. And then you can also think through where you're going to plant something that might need support. We're actually going to plant dahlias on the back of this fence this year, and then they're just going to automatically have a place that they can lean up against, or we could tie them to if we need to. And that way we don't have to think about staking them. They already have a spot where they're staked up. So all those beautiful bulbs that you planted back in the fall that we'll talk about when we get around to fall, that's going to be daffodils and hyacinths and tulips and those kinds of things. They come up, they bloom for us, they're blooming, heck, there's some daffodils blooming even right now in early January, but they'll be blooming January, February, March, possibly into early April, just depends on how hot it is. The foliage doesn't look all that great on them by the time that we're at this point in the video, but you need to leave that foliage up. That plant is absorbing the sun's energy and rebuilding that bulb for the following year. So leave that foliage up. I know it doesn't look all that great, but we tend to plant our bulbs in the middle of other things, in the middle of other groupings, so that some of our summer perennials are coming up at that time and kind of covering them up. We don't plant our daffodils out in just big groups of daffodils, because then it does kind of look bad. But by the time our daffodils the foliage is starting to fade, our perennials are coming up in the middle of them. Before you do, they will eventually fade back enough that you can start to clean them up. Before you do that, you might want to think about mapping them out, because if you're going to do any summer planting, fall planting, bed expansion, any kind of landscaping you're doing around them, you're going to want to know where they are. The shrubs I held off pruning until they flowered, things like azaleas and that loropetalum over there, whatever it was. It's a super early spring flowering plant. By the time we get around to late April, early May, those things have bloomed out and it's time to prune them. And so if I need to prune them hard, I'll prune them at that time. The Most of my shrub pruning I'm trying to get done before the 4th of July. I don't want to do a lot after that. I'll do some, again, crazy limb kind of pruning off of things any time of the year, but if it's general pruning, I want to have that stuff done by midsummer, because I don't want to put it back in a growth cycle and it not shut down properly going into winter. I've only fertilized the shrubs and trees and things in the ground once a year, and that'll be sometime in late February. But your containers may need additional fertilizer. So those things that you're, flowering baskets, flowering things we're putting in containers, even these shrubs, I'll fertilize them in late February. Sometime around late May, I might fertilize them again. I'm also going to be fertilizing my vegetable garden on a turnover. So between my cool season veggies that I've talked about and my summer vegetables, there'll be another application of fertilizer going down up there. Again, it's always organic. It's always organic for us. And again, here we are coming up on summer. Visit gardens again. There's always something interesting, something that you may or may not know that can add interest into your garden at every time of the year. By the time we come around to summer, sometime in mid-spring, we will have planted all of our flowering annual plants and our summer vegetable garden over there, and cool season vegetables will have been long gone. And we're at the point of maintaining some of those summer annuals. All of our perennials that were asleep during the winter, that were coming up during the spring, are probably starting to bloom. About that time of year, we may do a little bit of deadheading around the garden, as flowers fade here or there, or sometimes your annuals can come up a little bit thin, and we might go through and just give them, take the top off of them one time, sometime early in the summer, and that will fill them out, and they'll produce a lot more flowers during the summer. I don't hesitate to keep planting during the summertime at all, especially herbaceous perennials. And this is a conversation I've had with many people in the business over the years, is that when herbaceous perennials, these are the plants that don't become woody, when they're actively growing, and they tend as a group, our summer flowering perennial things, and even including ferns and some of our evergreen perennials as well, cast iron plants, that kind of thing. Those things that don't become woody, when they're actively growing, they're pushing new roots, and when they go in the ground, they anchor themselves really, really quickly when those roots are actively growing. So some people actually think summer's the best time to be planting some of those things, especially early summer, which gets them established before fall. I'll let you decide on that. It's hot outside, so some people may not want to be doing any planting at that time. Definitely watering becomes, that's the main task that I'm probably doing early summer every year, outside of a little bit of deadheading and always weeding. I don't care what time of year it is. You want to stay on top of weeds so that you don't end up having more weed seed produced and the issue getting larger every year. You want it declining every year. You're never going to get rid of it, but you want to be gaining control over weeding, not losing control of weeding. And I've spent a lot of time in the nursery business, landscape business. It doesn't matter where you are. If you let weeds take a bed one time, it's a big fight again to get those things under control. But water-wise, your containers are definitely going to need to be watered. We all know our hanging baskets just demand water. My established shrubs out here, I'm in the southeast United States, we get fairly regular rainfall. If a shrub's been in the ground more than 2 years, it really needs to be, for me, something that I don't water unless we're in kind of drought conditions. It has to go a long time before I water that thing. Something that's less than 2 years old, I'm just evaluating it on a plant-to-plant basis. Most of my leafy evergreen plants are pretty good at letting me know they're dry. They wilt. Some conifers and some of our plants like Japanese hollies are a great example of a plant that really doesn't wilt. You might see a color change in the leaf a bit when it needs water, but may not be something you pick up on, and then it'll start losing leaves. So the plants that will let you know, the wilting plants, are a good indicator that you probably need to be going around your yard and looking at some of the plants that don't give you those great indications. Again, that's definitely going to be conifers, things like junipers, Chamaecyparis, pines, any of those kinds of things. And then some of our hollies and things that just aren't good at letting you know that they're dry. But if there's an indicator out in your garden that's kind of newer planted, that's telling you every day, then go around and check. Don't water just to water, water because you need water. I'll typically go down and dig down a couple inches around the base of a plant. If it's dry, I'm watering. If it's not, then I'm going to move on. Sometimes late in the day wilting is not something I'll water for, because by the time the sun goes down, it's perked right back up. And the reason it was actually wilting is just it was losing water faster than it could take it up from the ground. It's kind of upside down at that moment. It's got too much foliage on top for the roots to be bringing enough water up to it on the top. That's not something that can be cured by watering it more, if that makes any sense. If you just drown the soil, it still can't get the water up there. So pay attention to that. If it's just late afternoon wilting and then it seems fine by 9 p.m. or something, that's probably just a plant that will correct itself over some period of time of it rooting out into the surrounding soil. A couple of things I want to be thinking about in the early summer are, have all my shrubs just kind of bloomed out, and all of my shrubs just bloom in the spring? There are summer flowering shrubs and summer flowering perennial things that come back every year that you don't have to replace. And it might be a good time to, again, head out to a garden somewhere, head out to a local garden, botanic garden, arboretum somewhere, and see the things that are still blooming even when the summer heat takes over and, water becomes a little bit less. I mean, the things that can kind of fight through and still perform in your garden during the summertime. Those things will be pretty evident by middle June every year. The other thing I'm thinking about is maybe a second round of a few of the flowering things that I use as annuals out here in the landscape. So I plant some giant I plant two different types of zinnias out here. We'll plant some really compact zinnias. They tend to perform well all summer long, but we also do some giant zinnias. They tend to bloom, kind of burn out by midsummer every year. And I may come back in and plant something that will take its place and flower the rest of the summer. So if you're thinking about a second round of some flowering annuals that you can start from seed, right there at the beginning of June would be the time to do that. Same thing with your vegetable garden. Assume that some of your vegetables plants will be burned out by middle summer. Don't know what those are, maybe at this point, but by the 4th of July, you're gonna know that some things are gonna have to come out. Maybe they're getting disease problems, whatever's happening in there. There's going to be spaces opening up during the summer in your vegetable garden and in your flower garden. And you might want to go ahead and start some seeds for that. Might be something that's already performing really well in the garden that you're excited about. You got a few seeds left, get them started, and they can go in and they'll perform right through, in my area, through about October. A few other things to think about in your edibles in the garden. One is a lot of our herbs will try to bloom when it gets hot during the summertime. I typically will take off any of those flowers, and I want to produce more leaves than flowers. That might include something like sage, which will try to bloom, maybe oregano, some of those things. I want to produce more foliage. Don't necessarily want them blooming if they're, if I'm using them as edibles. Some of these things have actually very attractive flowers if you want to just use them as flowering plants and just take a little bit here or there. But I try to stop the herbs from blooming during the summertime, and that would even include the annual herbs like basil, just tipping, as they're trying to bloom, because those flowers will slow down the production of leaves, which is what we're trying to eat. Of course, there in the early summer, we'll be harvesting potatoes, and if you're following the channel, you'll see the potatoes go in March and harvested sometime. The heat kills them back here, and that's when we harvest them. And we'll harvest the potatoes, and then we'll put some potatoes right back in the same bags, harvest them again in the fall later. So you guys following along with the channel, you'll see that. Also the time to be harvesting onions, if you've done onions, garlic, those kinds of things that were planted earlier in the year or at the end of the year. They can be planted here in my area, at the end of this video rather than where we started in this video. The other thing in the vegetable garden is just keep picking. You got to keep picking. So if you go on vacation and you're leaving, have neighbors come over and say, take all you want. Make sure, if the plant thinks it's produced seed, it will, they can slow down. And so if you keep picking, the plant just keeps keeps growing, keeps flowering, keeps producing. So again, that's what we typically do if we're leaving town. We'll just have neighbors come over and, take all you want, and they usually, free food, why not? Pruning is kind of important here. Most of any major pruning you'd want to do would be done by the 4th of July. So if I have, if I have a shrub and I need to take it pretty far back, if I need to just give some general pruning to it, if I'm pruning on trees during the summertime, I want a lot of those things done by middle summer because, pruning actually creates growth and, kind of stimulates the plant to start growing. And so if we get too close to fall with any of that pruning, sometimes we can put new growth on things right before they get a hard freeze. So any of my major pruning, I kind of want it done by the 4th of July. Again, I say this all the time. If you've got a crazy limb on something, this is a great example of that. This big piece of this sunshine, or Florida sunshine Alyssium that's sticking 2.5 feet above the plant, I can just take this off anytime. It's not, there's no rule for that. If it's a crazy limb, take it off. General pruning, all the way around this plant, I want to do that sometime between, I don't rely on this plant as a flowering shrub, so I'll prune this plant anytime between like March and the 4th of July, because I know I'm going to stimulate growth on it when I do. I can't say this enough, I use very little fertilizer in the garden here. Most of this is being done by mulch breaking down, and the mulch is what's feeding the plants as it breaks down. There's compost, it's forming compost and breaking down into humus, and all the microbes in the soil are what's feeding the plants. So I'm fertilizing very little. So I'm only fertilizing the shrubs once a year, said that earlier in the video. But containers, again, can be a little bit more demanding. So sometime in midsummer, I'll go through and fertilize the containers once again. I may give a second round to the vegetable garden as well. I'm evaluating that. I'm not gonna put it on the calendar and say I'm gonna fertilize my vegetables the 15th of July every year. If they're growing vigorously and producing well, I don't want to hit them with something that's going to force a lot of new growth on them. Forcing a lot of new tender growth on them very quickly, and it may visually look like you're helping the plant, can be sometimes the trigger for insect problems. So just throwing that out there. Judge your fertilizer based on what you're seeing visually. If something's growing well and it seems happy in that container, it doesn't seem to be off color, what's the real purpose in fertilizing it other than you put it on a calendar? So again, I try not to do that. Midsummer, I'm evaluating the performance of things out here. If I started something as an annual in the house and planted it in mid-April and it's not performing well by midsummer, it's getting yanked out of the ground. I don't, I expect to walk out here in midsummer and see things in pretty good shape. Late summer, things can start to get tired looking, but around the 4th of July, I actually want the garden looking pretty good here in the southeast. And so if there's vegetable plants that just look diseased and, in poor condition, they're not producing anything, they'll come out. Hopefully I've started some seed already for a couple other things I can plug in there. Same thing with my annuals. If there's annuals that need to come out, if it's a perennial that's come up the last 4 years and hasn't bloomed or produces 2 flowers, it's getting yanked out. It's an opportunity for me to put something else in. Same thing for a shrub or a tree. If it's something that's really underperforming, sometimes there can be out of, I literally have hundreds of different types of plants out here. Out of the hundreds of plants that are out here, if there's 2 or 3 plants that are taking 50% of my time, and they will be, this is how it always is. If you're teaching first grade, there's one kid that's driving you nuts, right? I mean, it's just always, it's usually a small number of things that are occupying lots of your time and attention. Those are decisions that midsummer, I'm pulling them out because that's the peak of the time of year they'd be demanding for water, for fertilizer, nutrients. Maybe it's a trailing plant that's going all over your beds and it's just causing you constantly to have to cut it back. Whatever it is, those are the, midsummer is when I'm making those decisions on what gets yanked. And to me, that looks like an opportunity to put something else in later in the fall. I really don't do a whole lot of maintenance during the summertime in the garden. Hopefully, Again, that mulching earlier in the season, has held down some of the weeds. Any disturbances you're doing, all these planting things I'm talking about, if you're planting perennials, you're planting shrubs, make sure that you're, maybe have a few extra bags of mulch if you're using bagged mulch, or have a few extra wheelbarrows somewhere stashed away that you can use to kind of patch those places. If any place you're disturbing the soil is going to create places where weeds are going to readily germinate. And so, make sure you're capping off those places. Any work that I'm doing out here, is potential for, me disturbing the ground and creating weed issues. Toward the end of summer, we will start our fall vegetable seeds in the house, and those will go in the garden sometime around September 15th. And so again, I'm looking at the seed packet and backing up ever how long it says. If something says it's, it takes 6 weeks from a seed to a transplant, then I'm starting at August 1st to put it in September 15th, if that makes any sense. A lot of our root crops that we do in the fall, I don't start from seed in the house. So things like beets, carrots, those get seeded directly in the ground. And the other, and again, just get a vegetable chart and you can see when that's done. I want to keep my summer vegetables as long as possible. So, I'm keeping those in good shape. I'm pruning the suckers out of my tomatoes and keeping those staked, keeping some air movement around them, getting out diseased plants, all of those kinds of things. This is how early I actually buy my seed for the following year, sometime during the summertime. I'm talking about this, all the time, but if there's things out here that we've planted that performed really well, I want to make sure I have them again for next year. So if there's a tomato that I really love from this year, I'll go ahead and order it. I don't necessarily order the new things that I'm going to do for the following year, but I definitely, if there's very specific zinnias, marigolds, I don't really care what it is that you like from something you did this year. Go ahead and acquire it during that late summer period. You won't start the seed until for 6 months after you get them, but you'll have them in hand. There's a lot of new people gardening in the last few years, and seed has been a little short. There's seed to get, it's just not necessarily the exact thing that you want. So if you got something in mind, go ahead and grab it. Noting everything that's been a success and failure in your garden is very important. The only way to really move forward, if you're changing some things out year to year, is to know what you liked and what you didn't like. It's really hard for me to remember. So our kind of rule over here in the vegetable area is we have about 4 tomatoes that we like to have every year that we really, really like, and we'll add 2 or 3 new ones every year just to try something new. And we do the same exact thing on the annuals out here. So there's some go-to annuals that we really, really love. And if you see tour videos out here, you'll know which ones those are. And we want to get those seed as early as possible. And then we experiment with about 20%, 25% of the garden as an experiment every year to find something new or different, not have it be the same every spring, summer, and fall. So, that's something we're thinking through. A little bit of new and a little bit of, I know this works for sure. So the insects that were dormant during the winter and the early spring start to have an impact by late spring, and by summer, boy, they're really full on. And these can be damaging insects chewing on your plants. It can be lots of beneficial insects, but the nights, the days go from the sounds of birds to the sounds of insects. That's what happens during our summers here. I don't spray anything out here. Something you need to know in gardening is the beneficial insects come after the bad guys. And so if you have aphids on something, little chewing insects on, on your plants, frequently, if you have a lot of different types of plants, you're keeping the soil covered, you're inviting birds in, you're doing all you can, to make sure that your soil's in good shape and your plants are in good condition to fight off, any kind of insect and disease problems. Most of the time, and I had this happen last year in a tour video, I showed aphids on a grapevine over here, and literally the next week they were gone. I don't know what took them. I have no idea. Doesn't matter. I actually had you'll see ants, kind of hard, ants like the secretion that the aphids The aphid secretion is sweet, and the ants like to do it. So there were ants on it, there were aphids on it. Boy, they were doing their thing, and then the next thing you know, they were gone. So I know from experience that you're not going to get the good guys and the bad guys at the exact same moment. I'm probably going to take a little bit of damage on something while I'm waiting for something positive to happen in the garden to balance it out. Sometimes those things don't balance out, and if it's a plant that's being hit over and over and over again, it might be in that same decision group of, you know, something that's just problematic in the garden and needs to go. You know, it might be not getting quite the amount of sun that it needs. It may be something, it may be a cultivar or variety that's just not disease or insect resistant. Might be that your area is slightly too hot for that plant, and so that summer stress is causing it to be vulnerable to insect and disease. But evaluate this, you know, objectively. That, you know, if it means you're going to have to spray it and spray it and spray it and spray it and spray it forever, is that something that you really want to do? Or, you know, if you could tear that thing out and put something in that would not require you to do that, seems like a much happier, you know, a better outcome. So as we get toward the end of summer, again, I said write down your successes and failures. The other thing you might want to do is make some notes on the names of all the perennials that are in the ground, and maybe do some sort of marking of them before they go dormant. Maybe you're going to be doing some work in that area later in the fall. You know, you can use golf tees, whatever you want to do to mark those things, or at least make some sort of grid diagram that allows you to know where some of the perennials are, the things that are going to go to sleep in the winter, and you're not going to know where they are otherwise. So you don't want to be planting on them over the winter. It's the time of year that we order spring bulbs, is in the late summer, so you might be putting some bulbs in later in the fall and in the winter, and you don't want to, you know, take your drill and drill directly down through your newly planted perennial. So knowing where those things are will be helpful for any planting you're going to do in the fall or the winter. And again, also having it marked. If it happened to die during the winter time and didn't come back, you'd have oh, hold on, I had a such and such there and it didn't come back. And maybe then you know that, you know, you don't end up buying that thing twice, you know, and spending extra money. Coming around to the fall, I'm going to jump back into the garden and do a lot of work again, just like I do in February. And again, if you're subscribed to the channel, you're going to see in February the videos come fast and furious, because I'm fertilizing, I'm edging, I'm creating new beds. It's easy to dig, and I want to get all these things done, and I want to put a mulch cap down before, you know, my spring weeds happen. So boom, 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 boom. We're working like crazy. Then we go through a period that's just really maintenance. We'll be doing some planting, you know, when it's in mid-April. For annuals, and, you know, mid to late April, depending on the weather, and putting in the vegetable garden. Those things aren't that bad because all the prep has been done already back in February. We're coming back around to fall, boom, we're back at it, because I want to get another mulch cap down sometime in the month of September or early October, before that henbit and chickweed that I showed you earlier in the video, which inevitably you're going to have some of those winter weeds they come up, they sit there, they don't do anything, and then in the March, before spring really gets going, they just absolutely go crazy, and they can take over your garden very quickly. So again, we jump back in, we're tearing some things out that aren't looking all that good. A lot of my annuals, some of my vegetables, a lot of those things can last for us right through October. Some of them are just really burnt out and don't look that great by September. Those will come out. Any space in the garden that needs to be weeded, edged, cleaned, generally things put away. Another thing I didn't say in the summer garden is about making sure that you don't have standing water all over the place, because another one of our pests, of course, is mosquitoes. That just popped in my head. I do several times during the summer, you know, walk around the garden and assess, you know, where water could be standing and, you know, where mosquito problems. But again, early fall, I'm just jumping back in, getting the place cleaned up, getting it in good shape, and putting down a mulch cap again. And so I'm using the same amount of mulch as maybe you're using in one time, and I'm just dividing that in two and doing again in the fall to prevent some of those weeds. I then will get leaves dropping on top of them. I'll talk more about that in a second. Weird shooting a video about early fall in January, because this whole porch would be full of containers with flowers in them that had grown all summer and filled out. And instead I'm sitting here with two very cold tolerant containers, and the rest of my containers are all packed away. Fall is a great time to plant. And again, I plant 12 months out of the year. So when I say fall is I don't really rank one over another. If I'm able to get outside and dig a hole and I'm around to water it for a couple weeks and monitor it, I just plant anytime. But fall is a great time to plant, partly because it tends to be cooler outside. It's drier, and so we're gonna have to do a little bit more watering, but that dryness allows us to get out and work. I mean, I can probably plan for any Saturday and Sunday to do a project during the fall here in the Southeast, and I'm not gonna have rain get in the way unless there's a hurricane or tropical storm or something. But for the most part, we get dry weekends, and they're cooler. They're not 95, they're 80. And so it's easy to work, lower humidity, and again, I can kind of guarantee myself that Saturday I'm gonna be able to work in the garden. Also, we see garden centers flipping over to Christmas earlier and earlier, it seems, every year. So there's probably opportunities to get clearance plants as well and save yourself some money. So I'm going to tell you, in all 4 seasons, go to arboretums and go to public gardens and see things that are blooming at different times of the year, because going into fall, especially here in the South, there are so many things that we can have blooming. We can have shrubs like mahonias and camellias that bloom. We can have, abelia here blooms until September, November. Probably blooms better than it blooms any other time during the sun. During the spring, it doesn't bloom in the spring. Starts to bloom sometime around midsummer and blooms till November. There's tons of things. Even rosemary, here blooms during the fall months in our area here in the Southeast. So tons of shrubs. Osmanthus back here behind me starts blooming in the fall. I can go on and on. There's a ton of fall flowering things. And then of course, perennial wise, we have hardy mums, not necessarily the little meatballs that you see on the tables, but they're actually mums that come back year to year very well. Some of them can be bullies in the garden. So, keep that in mind, but, give them some space. Then we have all kinds of hardy fall blooming asters that almost everybody watching can grow. So there's actually tons of opportunities. There's a lot of late Caryopteris comes to mind as another late flowering, late summer, early fall flowering shrub that can bloom right through the fall. Mine bloomed up until we got a hard freeze 2 weeks ago in December. So keep that in mind. Go out and explore your area. Some of those fall blooming perennials, backing up in this video a bit, just popped in my mind. If you have asters or you have mums, some of those fall blooming, sedum would be an upright sedum, like autumn joy would be another example of this. Sometime earlier in the summer, if those things are a bit leggy, they're getting a bit out of control, you can actually cut them in half before the 4th of July sometime. That will thicken them up, and then when they come into bloom in the fall, they'll be much fuller, denser, lots more flowers. Again, fall is pretty dry here in my area in the Southeast, so I am monitoring anything that I'm planting in the fall for sure pretty closely. They probably won't be growing as much because most plant growth occurs at night, and once the nighttime temperatures start to back off, they won't be growing as much, except for some fall. There are some cool season things that grow much quicker that time of year. But as a general rule, once the nighttime temperatures start to slow down, they start using water less. But it doesn't mean that you don't need to monitor it. And when you water thoroughly and walk away. That's my kind of my watering rule is drown and forget. That way, don't water just because it's Tuesday. Water because it needs water, and when it needs water, really saturate the entire area pretty well, and not just right at the base of the plant, but out into a wider area that will, kind of ask the plant to root out and get some of that water as well. So if you bought spring flowering bulbs, the daffodils, tulips, all those kinds of things, in the late summer as they were appearing in the garden centers and mail order, that kind of thing, it'll be time to put those in the ground toward mid to late fall after we've gotten some cold outside. Here in the South, tulips, hyacinths, a few other things don't come back necessarily reliably for us, so we use those as annuals. If you purchase those, you may need to refrigerate them for 6 weeks. I've got videos on the channel. There's a whole playlist for bulbs if you want to go back and take a look and learn how to do spring flowering bulbs. If you have summer flowering bulbs, like I talked about earlier in the video, if you have caladiums, if you have elephant ears, if you have dahlias, some of those things are not perennial depending on where you live and need to be dug out of the ground to be kept from year to year. There's plenty of videos on YouTube on how to dig those things and store them, but it's something you need to be thinking about in the fall. Are the things that you planted hardy, and if they're not hardy, is there a possibility of me digging them out and storing them for the winter? So for me, most of those things I leave in the ground because we're right on the edge of them being hardy. Those of you in colder areas, you can decide for yourself whether you want to repurchase it, treat it as an annual, or dig it up and store it for the wintertime. A few other things I'm jumping in and doing in the early fall is I'm collecting seed. So I have lots of dahlias out here that cross with one another, and I collect the seed on them at the end of the season. I've shown that in some videos. Other perennials as well, I can go through and collect seed that time of year. On the old flowers, some of my zinnias, easy to keep the seed on. Celosia, there's tons of things that are actually very easy to collect the seed, let them dry out some, store them in some sort of jar or paper. You can look up how to store seed. Again, you can learn anything on YouTube, right? And store those seeds and use those rather than purchasing them on a year-to-year basis. A lot of times I'll buy a seed just to make sure I have it while I'm still tinkering with whether or not I can just collect it. Once I figure out that I can definitely collect it and I get good germination the next year, I don't have to buy that one anymore. So that's kind of my process. I pick off the flowers on my vegetables in the early fall. I always figure that let's say by the end of September for me, I always figure that tomato is not going to actually be able to produce a finished tomato from that flower once we get to that part of the season. And so I let the plant put its energy into finishing the ones that it's already started to finish, if that makes any sense. So if they're still trying to flower, I'm just picking those flowers off and letting it put the remaining energy it can come up with on the shorter days into finishing the fruits that are already on the plant. So I started my fall vegetable seeds in the house sometime in August, sometime mid to late September. Those things go in the ground. Again, we're talking about lettuce and broccoli and cauliflower. And for me, some of the things that don't like our 95-degree days during the summertime, but love our long extended falls. Those things go in the ground, and they'll go in between some of my still standing vegetables from earlier in the season. And again, this is the time when you're really you're pulling out your annuals that are declining. You're pulling out your vegetable garden. You're starting to collect some material. Decisions need to be made on some of that stuff. If it's diseased, I'm not throwing it in the compost pile. If it's clean, it just all goes on a pile back here. For the most part, I don't have a lot of disease and insect issues that I need to worry about, but I don't like to put those things, back in the pile, because if the compost doesn't get hot enough to kill those things when you're reusing it, you could be adding them right back in. If you do hot compost, I don't think this matters. You can put anything you want to in there. It's going to kill most. It's going to kill most everything. But my compost pile back here is pretty much what I would call a cold compost. It composts, it's breaking down. It doesn't necessarily get up to the heat that's going to kill some of those disease-related issues. So diseased materials, I would just figure out a different way to dispose of them. A little bit after my fall vegetables get planted, our winter annuals go in. I talked about this earlier in the video. This is that middle fall is when I'm planting pansies and snapdragons, dianthus, some things that will bloom for us during the winter time, or at least establish themselves during the winter time, so that in the late winter, early spring, they can really put on a big show. Those will go in that time of year, and both of those things will get fertilizer at that time. That's the only fertilizing I'm doing. I mean, it's a very limited amount of fertilizing, but when the fall vegetable garden goes in, it gets a little bit of fertilizer. And it gets new compost. That's the time of year I actually put the compost in the vegetable garden, and those newly planted annuals will get fertilizer as well. Oh no, sometime in the late fall, all the leaves are gonna fall on the ground, and I'm gonna have so much work to do. I gotta bag them up so the city can come and get them. I don't do any of that. We leave the leaves. We rake the leaves off of our annual spaces, so that would include the fall vegetable garden. If we have any blowing in there, that would include on the pansies and then, of course, any lawn areas we take the leaves off of. because leaves will definitely damage the turf. The rest of the area, we have a big giant oak back here that drops too many leaves concentrated back here behind where I'm filming right this second. And we'll take a few of those and add them into other bed areas in the garden. There'll eventually be a cap of mulch going on top of this. There's a lot of living creatures in these leaves that drop down to the ground during the winter time, and you'll see robins flipping these leaves over all winter looking for some of those things. These leaves are helping keep just like the mulch that's underneath it. It's mulch. It's just a different form of mulch. This material is keeping the soil warmer during the winter time, making sure I'm keeping all those beneficial bacteria, beneficial fungi, all those things alive in the soil. Nature is constantly trying to tell us to cover the soil, and humans are constantly trying to uncover it for some reason. But these are an important part of the life process, especially this oak behind me. It's the host for for literally hundreds of beneficial and probably some not beneficial insects. For me, it's supposed to look like winter out here. I do tidy up, so there's not pots laying everywhere and tools laying everywhere and things that need to be planted and piles of things. And, I'm trying to keep it neat, but I don't have an expectation that November, December, January, that the garden is going to look pristine. I feel like, and that's a personal thing. I don't think it needs to look perfect that time of year. There's plenty of interesting things still going on out here because, again, I'm going to places year round and looking at what would look good for, in this garden 12 months out of the year. What can, seasonally, how can I get color? One thing leaves bloom and another thing comes into bloom. And by doing that, we still have interest out here without having to feel like the garden has to look absolutely perfect in December. Beyond just leaving the leaves for our native creatures to survive in and to put a barrier down on the soil, we also leave our native perennials standing through the winter. So that could be native grasses and then native flowering perennials like Joe Pye weed or black-eyed Susans or cone flowers. Doesn't really matter what it is. There's a lot of life also on those. We'll take some, also an opportunity to take the seeds on them, and by leaving them standing, any seeds that I'm not taking, things like goldfinches, can have access to. So those things don't get cut down and cleaned up until late winter, early spring when the new growth is coming on them. I talked about that earlier in the video, but we do leave any of our native herbaceous plants standing in the garden. Again, I know the temptation is to go through and just everything's got to look neat. Everything's got to look the same 12 months out of the year. And I just leave those things standing. They're beneficial to some of our natives. So by mid to late fall, we get our first frost here sometime around October 17th. Ish, and I say that because that's when the North Carolina State Fair is usually going on. So sometime around there, we always get our first frost or a taste of our first frost. So house plants need to come back in if you've taken them outside during the summer months, or you have them on a porch. I take this opportunity in October to evaluate houseplants just like I evaluated all the shrubs and perennials and things that weren't making me happy in the garden in the summertime. I do this with houseplants in the fall. If it's a houseplant that I've had for 3 years and I just no longer can figure out why I have it, something to water and it's got 4 leaves on it and it leans to the right, it might be a plant that I go ahead and dispose of or try to improve in some way. But this is the time of year we do our pot switcheroo. I don't want to bring the houseplants back into the house with insects in the soil or whatever's figured out how to crawl in there during the summertime while they were outside. And so we'll repot them, put some amount of new soil in. I rarely replace all the soil in a container ever. Normally I'll just take some out and replace it with some. So if it's going to stay in the same container, sometimes I'll remove a little bit of that soil, put a little bit of new fresh soil in there. And I may fertilize them lightly before they come back into the house, but lightly. They don't do a whole lot of growing in the house during the winter time. And so again, pushing plants, has a tendency to cause some insect problems and cause some issues. So keep that in mind. Even in the house, there's going to be lower light, and they're going to want to be in a little bit of a dormancy. They may do a little bit of growing during the winter, but for the most part, you know, I don't want to be pushing them that time of year. Really, the purpose of this video is to show you that I plan pretty far out in advance how the year is going to go. You know, I'm acquiring seeds well in advance. I know that I know the window when my summer vegetable seed is going to be started. I know the window when my summer flowers are going to be started. I know the 2 windows a year that I'm going to mulch. I know how I'm going to handle certain things. I know when things are going to go in the ground, and that's, you know, that way by planning in advance, you know, I can acquire these things before that period of time. And so I do these monthly checklist videos, but by the time I'm doing the monthly checklist video, I will have planned 3 months ago that I was going to be planting, you know, my dahlias after the frost, you know, and I would have started them. I would have collected the seed in the fall. I would have stored it through the winter, and then I would have started it about 6 weeks before it went into the ground. So, you know, that's the purpose of this video. It's just showing that I am thinking, you know, in advance, but a lot of my thoughts around gardening are how to make it less labor, okay, and more enjoyment, and less money and more enjoyment. So less time spent working in it. And so by planning the time of year that you're mulching and putting this cap down on it and leaving the leaves during the winter time is also helping with some of my weed control and some of my winter hardiness issues, you know, by keeping the soil warmer, by keeping the roots warm around these plants, you know. So by limiting, you know, by fertilizing, but limiting the amount of fertilizer I'm using and thinking through those things. And so, again, there's a plan, there's a method to the madness. And so all of these things will get documented on the channel over the course of the year. So with 1,300 plus videos on the channel, I've covered lots of these things in more detail that you could search for on my main channel. If you want to jump in with some really in-depth information, I have a Learn to Grow video series over on my website that you can sign up for there, and there's a discount code below this video for that. And in that, I really go into detail about why I use organic fertilizer versus synthetic fertilizer, and really just in-depth videos if you want to jump in and learn more about gardening. So thank you guys for following along. Again, make a comment down below if there's something that you feel like that you do in your garden that's important enough that I missed in this format. Thanks for watching.